Mr. Hasdovic's online lecture series, lecture number 13, The Nifty 50s. Even though it would be hard to argue that the 1950s wasn't the decade in which America finally assumed its mantle of global leadership and economic domination by casting away once and for all the Monroe Doctrine, the 50s also were a dichotomy of contrasts. While we were firmly entrenched in waging a Cold War against the Soviet Union, combating communism in the Korean Peninsula, and living under an ever-growing cloud of the threat of nuclear war, most Americans experienced a profound increase in the quality of life and standard of living that this decade offered. As one of the only two superpowers left standing after World War II, the U.S. enjoyed not only a tremendous amount of economic prosperity, but also global popularity. We were the sponsors behind the United Nations, a new global organization formed from the nations involved in the Atlantic Charter during World War II, an organization that many millions around the world had hoped would usher in a new era for human rights, despite the fact that this organization was founded solely with the intention of preventing World War III, not necessarily defending human rights. The changes and innovations that would break ground in the 1950s would have profound repercussions felt strongly to this day. It's not to say, however, there weren't some bumps along the road to national greatness. In tonight's lecture, we will examine the 1950s from four different perspectives. We will look at the difficult transitional period America went through after winning World War II. We will see how Americans defined once and for all what the American dream meant. We will see how popular culture dramatically changed during this decade, ushering in two new phrases into our common lexicon, TV and rock and roll. And finally, we will look at the other America, those citizens who, just as in the past, had been left out of the progress of the 1950s, that is, the poor and ethnic minorities. Post-war America, a shaky return to normalcy. During World War II, the U.S. had over 16 million citizens, mostly men, in its armed forces. With the successful conclusion of the war in August of 1945, the need for a defense this massive greatly diminished. 1 year later, by the summer of 1946, roughly 10 million men and women were released from duty in the armed forces and returned home. Despite the fact that these millions were no doubt happy to return to civilian life, they would be greeted with some tough adjustments. First and foremost, there was a dramatic shortage of homes available for the returning GIs, most of whom left for war as 18 to 21-year-old boys and returned as 23 to 28-year-old men with wives and babies on the way. Tensions flared as the millions of women, 75% of whom were married, who had stepped up to the role of breadwinner, were asked after the war to return to the traditional life of a homemaker. While working, most women discovered that they loved the feelings of independence and accomplishment they found outside the house, and were often unwilling to give up their jobs for men. But many did just that. For over 1 million American women, however, divorce became the answer to this conflict created between a husband who wanted a traditional wife and a wife who wanted to celebrate her independence and embark on a new set of traditions. Divorce rates would only continue to rise as men and women found successful domestic partnership far too difficult to manage. Adjusting to peace would prove very difficult indeed for people who had once been employed by the War Production Board. Within 1 week of Japan's surrender, the government canceled $35 billion in contracts, which resulted in laying off over 1 million workers. By March of 1946, over 3 million people were looking for work. When the Office of Price Administration relaxed its grip over the price of consumer goods in an effort to combat inflation during the war, the costs for nearly all consumer goods soared. Within 2 weeks, prices on almost all products shot up 25%. Businesses were not only looking to capitalize off the freedom to charge their own rate for products, they were also adjusting to shortages, as sugar, coffee, and beans were still in short supply because of the war. In many cases, rationed products would not be readily available until over 3 years after the end of World War II in 1948. Coupled with the massive influx of labor as soldiers returned from war, many Americans saw their earnings decrease when compared to what they made during the war, when the government controlled many people's salaries. To Despite all of this hardship, however, America made an amazing recovery after World War II. After more than half a decade of rationing, Americans were hungry for consumer goods that they couldn't buy during wartime. Further, with Europe and Japan in ruins, America, which had once been the arsenal of democracy, had become the construction facility of peace. Since so many factories and farms were devastated on both sides of the globe, Europe and Japan were very hungry for American products, from steel to farmed goods, concrete to glass. In order to help get themselves back on their economic feet, Europe and Japan needed America. The Marshall Plan provided desperate and poor Europeans the money they needed to buy those materials. And these materials almost invariably came and were produced from America. From one perspective, one can look at the Marshall Plan as merely a multi-billion-dollar investment right back into the U.S. economy. The billions of dollars worth of war bonds millions of Americans bought during the war were rapidly getting cashed in by the late 1940s and early 1950s. As Americans had more and more money in their pockets, they spent more. As they spent more, the economy quickly turned around, and U.S. businesses were more productive than ever before. Americans couldn't buy enough of their country's goods, nor did it seem could Europeans. The GI Bill, passed by Congress in 1944, also aided many returning veterans in the transition to peace. The GI Bill paid portions of veterans' tuition bills if they sought higher education. It gave veterans a year's worth of unemployment benefits as they searched for work back home, and it offered low-interest loans to help them start new businesses or even buy new homes. And buy homes they did. So strong was the demand for new homes after World War II that innovative industrialists William Levitt and Henry Kaiser responded with a method that would dramatically alter the landscape of nearly every city in the U.S. By applying assembly line and mass production techniques to building homes, Levitt bragged that his company could make a new home in 16 minutes flat. These mass-produced cookie-cutter houses were also inexpensive, running typically only $7,000, a sum easily affordable to a newly employed former GI. These homes did have one drawback, however, as they tended to all look very similar, and the neighborhoods, which were also nicknamed Levittown, after the company that provided the construction of so many homes, which sprung up surrounding cities all over America, seemed to have a very rigid conformity to their look. But cheap homes in nice, low-key neighborhoods away from the noise, hustle and bustle and crime of the big cities were actually very attractive to most people after World War II. As freeways connected these new suburbs directly to their neighboring cities, suburban America was truly born, as now the middle class could afford the drive into the city for work.